Ronald Reagan has often been a hero among the Republican Party for many reasons. Many of the things that he's said and many of his economic policies are still held to this day. I remember during the 2016 and really even other than that, many of the Republicans who wanted to be president were all falling all over themselves to say that they're the next Ronald Reagan and they want to be, carry on that tradition. So it's something, especially the GOP has always been behind for a long time. And when it comes to military power, they've especially jumped all over him because of his famous peace through strength statement, where he was, saying that's the best way to keep our country strong is to be safe. Well, as it's turned out over the years, what Reagan actually meant by peace through strength and what it's come to mean now and how it's used are starting to quite a bit diverge. And so we wanted to take a look at that today because here recently, there's been some people citing Reagan again and using him as a justification to try to do what's really kind of becoming more like the neocon view of, well, use force with everybody all over the place all the time. So to help unpack this, we have a really special guest today, somebody that I've known for quite a long time, and I'm thrilled to have him on the show today. Doug Bandow, currently a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and a former Reagan official and an advisor in the Reagan administration. So there's nobody better to talk about than this. Doug, welcome to the show. Glad you're here.
Happy to be on, Danny. Great to see you. Happy to share the podium with you.
Awesome. Yeah, we've actually shared a few podiums together over the years. Yeah. We've been on panels together. It's always been great. I always enjoy that. So glad to have you on today. Well, listen, let's just jump right into it because there's something just kind of lit a fire under me on Friday of last week. I'm not sure when the clip was actually made, but that's when I saw it with a former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, a 3-star retired general, who went on CBS News and was talking about how, weak America has become in his view. And he, as justification for what we ought to do, he brought up the ghost of Ronald Reagan. Watch this.
I think what we're forgetting is Reagan's phrase, peace through strength. And John, what I see that connects a lot of these cascading conflicts and the looming crises, maybe in the Indo-Pacific, is that the perception of weakness is what is provocative. I mean, I think the February 2022 massive invasion of Ukraine is directly connected to the humiliating surrender, self-defeat, and withdrawal from Afghanistan. I believe that October 7th is at least in part related to our apparent inability until just recently to sustain our support for the Ukrainians. If you're Ayatollah Khamenei and you look at the United States unable to support Ukraine, if you look at the contentious relationship, for example, between President Biden and President Netanyahu, for that matter, the Israeli perception of weakness in Israel based on unrest associated with the judicial reform movement and so forth. It's that perception of weakness, I think, that led Khamenei to say, okay, now's the time to cross this off my bucket list, my destroy Israel task. So I think that's what we have to regain, this idea that we can maintain peace really through strength.
So about peace through strength from the inside. What do you say when you hear something like that?
Well, of course, it's really quite silly. I mean, the notion that, I don't know, Vladimir Putin sits around and says, oh, if only they would take on the Taliban, then I'm sure they would fight us with our nuclear weapons. I mean, give me a break. You think that Putin is deciding his policy towards Ukraine based on whether we're willing to spend more? We spent 20 years in Afghanistan. That's twice as long as the Soviets. Presumably that gives us some credibility. And I find really weird the notion that Hamas made an attack based on us in Ukraine. I mean, apparently he's not aware that Palestinians have been occupied for 60 years.
That right.
Maybe that had something to do with it. I mean, this is really silly. I mean, people
or that Khamenei, who he responded, the Iranian leader there, might have had some reason to fight based on the fact that his embassy building got blown up by Israel. Right. I don't know if it's related, but
no, I mean, there are critics of Iran who pointed out that the attack on a diplomatic facility is a major escalation. So don't act as if, oh my goodness, where'd this come from? Well, there are reasons for, and I mean, and people always do this with Reagan. I mean, the point with Reagan is that, yeah, he was dealing with the Soviet Union, as he called it, I think accurately, an evil empire. This was the Cold War, a lot of concern about the Soviet Union, where it was going. But this is somebody who also adjusted his foreign policy for circumstances. I mean, if you read his diary, I mean, you see when Gorbachev comes along, he finally finds somebody he can deal with. And lo and behold, he's criticized by members of his own administration, which he acknowledges. But his view was he wasn't anti-Soviet just to be anti-Soviet. I mean, he had an agenda, and his overall agenda was peace. And he recognized circumstances change. This whole notion that everything, that whatever we do, we have to do the same thing forever, and that everybody on Earth is going to respond in some particular way to what we're doing. I mean, I think he would have thought was silly.
I wonder if I can ask Doug, just so people can understand a little bit better, what was your role within the Reagan administration, and did you ever actually have any direct interaction with him?
Well, I had a lot of contact with him. I worked in the campaign, so I started out, with a relatively small staff. Now, I was quite young at the time, so I'm not going to overplay my role. I mean, I did primarily economic issues, though I got into international stuff with Law of the Sea Treaty. I got into international development. I did work on military manpower, draft, issues. So I would be in the room, but I'd be at the back wall. I mean, my boss who I worked for was Marty Anderson. He'd be at the table with Reagan. Reagan knew who I was, but I don't want to overplay things. I had a nice, opportunity to watch and observe and have some interaction and seeing how he dealt with other people.
Yeah, and that's really what I wanted to focus on and then highlight the fact that, by being, people often say, well, I wish I could be a fly on the wall. You were actually, not that you were a fly, but you actually were able to listen.
I mean, Reagan was an extraordinary human being. I thought that, you just somebody who, he dealt with people very well. I mean, he was a very nice guy. I mean, the person who was really, really tough on personal relations was Nancy. I mean, she looked after his interests. If she thought you were doing bad things for him, oh my goodness, you didn't want to be in the room with her. But I mean, Reagan was smart, and he was not a policy nerd in the sense of wanting to do all the details, but this is a bright guy. He handed stuff to me on the campaign airplane and said, have you read this? Anyone who goes to the ranch, his ranch, he has books that he read that are still in the bookcases. And you can see them. They're economic texts. They're other things. He read this stuff. So this is a guy who knew what he wanted to do. And I think what's, to my mind, important if you look at national security is, he wanted to be tough on the Soviets, but his ultimate goal was peace. I mean, he wanted, people he was derided on that they called it Star Wars. But that came out of his horror at the notion that, if the Soviets launch missiles at us, all we can do is launch them back and kill millions of people. And he thought that was just horrendous.
Yeah.
I mean, Reagan had that sensible, moral kind of understanding that, wait, I have to commit mass murder. I mean, that's all I can do. That struck him as being very wrong. And after the Able Archer exercise in 1983, which I don't, listeners are aware of, this is back when the Soviets actually were really worried we were going to launch a preemptive strike. I mean, the book was written on it. It's really an interesting, looking back, we can say interesting at the time, frightening, thing where he understood coming out of that, wow, these people really were nervous about a nuclear attack. And he understood what could have come out of that he really wanted to open up talks. And to my mind, the great thing about him was when Gorbachev came along, Reagan understood there is somebody I can deal with. And to my mind, that's the critical thing. It was not just Reagan ending the Cold War, it's Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Two of them together at exactly the right time. You had somebody in the Soviet Union who actually wanted to keep the troops in the barracks, wanted to end the horrendous persecution of Jews, of dissidents, and whatever. And you had Reagan, who had established his reputation of peace through strength. So then he had the credibility to bring it all to an end. And I think we should be very happy at those two, because who knows what would have happened if either one hadn't been there. We could have had a Cold War go on for years more.
Yeah. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of those and hear from Reagan himself on talking about some of those things you just mentioned here. But before we do, I don't want to pick too much on H.R. McMaster like he's the only one in here. He's one of many. I'm going to play you a couple of clips here. And I just kind of want to go through this exercise of what would Reagan say if he was really here. A lot of people try to say what Reagan would say, but what do you think, from having, known him better than certainly any of us do? What do you think Reagan would say? First of all, let's see Brother Jack Keane.
Their plans are to hit every Russian military base of consequence in Crimea, using that weapon system to drive the Russians out of Crimea without having to put a foot on that territory there. In other words, to drive their military strong bases out of Crimea. It doesn't mean they're not occupying it politically or militarily, but that is their objective. And now they have the wherewithal to achieve that objective.
And just sort of put this in context for those who may not understand, the criticality of trying to say we're going to force Russia militarily out of Crimea, that is an absolute very thick red line for Vladimir Putin. He's never said anything besides that. And it was probability that if you succeeded doing that, it would almost certainly launch or result in a tactical nuclear response at least. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that what's critical here is that Reagan was, he was quoted as saying that, wanted the Cold War to end, they lose, we win. But of course, he was talking about a Cold War. He was not talking about a hot war. He was not talking about using military weapons to try to bombard Soviet territory. And even when you looked at Afghanistan, again, this was kind of the game that the superpowers played that was a dangerous one, but there are kind of rules. That is, you're not hitting each other's territory. You're talking about you're using proxies. You keep this relatively quiet. You don't have the New York Times quoting your officials exulting in how they're killing Russian generals and sinking Russian ships. And you don't have people on TV talking about we should bombard what is viewed as indisputably Russian territory. I think that Reagan would understand that, whoa. I mean, again, this is a man who is really afraid of nuclear war. And I think he would understand immediately the dangers of this, that these are people playing with fire and that there's an extraordinary irresponsibility there. We got through the Cold War without a nuclear war. We came close with Cuba, and we came out, I'm not sure if I'd call it close, but there are at least possibilities with Able Archer. There are a couple of other times where people thought missiles were being launched or whatnot. It was a dangerous time. Reagan wanted out of that. I don't think he'd say, let's, having survived the Cold War, I have a great idea. Let's do the same thing again. I don't believe that.
Yeah, I don't think so either, based on all the stuff, because I'm old enough to remember his presidency. One more here. Let's go with John Bolton, who's looking at a different theater here, but similar outcome.
I think the real problem here is that the administration simply will not face up to the reality that we're seeing a war being conducted by Iran through terrorist proxies. That's why I think that what's needed here is an attack on Iran.
Now, I'm going to actually play some of Reagan's inaugural speech in a minute, which kind of addresses some of this, but I don't see anywhere where Reagan was like saying, hey, let's have a preventive war against really the enemy of another country that's not threatening us, but yeah, let's just go get them. What would Reagan say if Bolton was his national security advisor?
I think Reagan would, number one, I think Reagan would ask, well, why are we being attacked? Well, the point is, why do we have troops in Syria? Why do we still have troops in Iraq? And one question he'd ask is, why do we have all these vulnerable, deployments that we're not being fair to our own people? I mean, but what's the national interest being served of having people in? I mean, Syria has always been a Soviet or Russian kind of friend. What are we doing there and getting involved in civil war? So I think first Reagan would wonder why we're there. And then second, I think he'd understand that attacking Iran, again, John's assumption seems to be that if we just attack Iran, they'll give up. What example do we have of other countries giving up? What we know is they have a lot of proxy forces. We know the harm they can do. I mean, Reagan saw, to me, one of the great moments for Reagan was getting out of Lebanon, where I think his biggest mistake was Lebanon. He used U.S. forces 3 times. The worst was putting them in the middle of a civil war in Lebanon. But he got it and realized that was a really dumb idea. And you read his own recollections. He admitted that at some point. He's kind of like, this is crazy. So the notion that, let's do this again, to me, he's learned that the opportunities of Iran to do harm on the U.S. as well as U.S. friends and allies are extraordinary. So you don't go bomb another country without some kind of, what's the outcome? And of course, Bolton simply assumes, that they will, they'll fly to Washington and surrender.
Right. Never heard them talk about the what next or what that's supposed to accomplish.
Exactly. That's right.
But so you see, I mean, I could just keep playing clip after clip. Lots of people these days love to talk about the primary effective of using strength is to cow everyone down and not really to have peace, but to just like threaten everyone into not doing anything. I think that's the view on it. Now, this is not the first time you're being asked about this. And in 2015, you published this article here at the Cato Institute called Betrayed, Why Reagan Would Be Ashamed of the Neocons. And so you've really looked at a lot of this stuff. I'm going to pull out three particular parts here, and then we're gonna talk about each one and see a little bit about what Reagan actually said that supports your contention here. The first one here is going to be that you, as you've kind of mentioned a minute ago, Reagan wanted to negotiate from a position of strength, but he wanted to negotiate. Reagan was horrified by the prospect of nuclear war, which drove him to propose creation of a missile defense and abolition of nuclear weapons. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about what led you to that, to write that.
Well, can you imagine any of these people who you've brought on kind of with the segments who would say we should get rid of nuclear weapons? I mean, Ronald Reagan did. I mean, that was viewed as a lefty position. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, you brought McMaster and Bolton and I mean Keene and all the usual others. I don't know, Lindsey Graham and I mean Tom Cotton and throw in all these folks. And if you simply said, well, do you think we should get rid of nuclear weapons? They don't view you as being some lefty commie. I mean, Reagan was horrified by the damage that could be done by nuclear weapons and wanted to get rid of them. We can argue whether we think it's possible or not. And I think that unfortunately it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. But to my mind, that gives you a sense of what Reagan was, that this is a man who, at some level, inner level, was a peacenik. And of course, that would horrify when he ran as like the mad cowboy. But he wasn't. This is a man who is horrified at the thought that millions of people could be killed. So the idea that you just kind of wander around the globe bombing people, and again, you need to have a plan, right? You need to have an outcome. And his outcome was peace. I mean, he wanted to, win against the Soviet Union, but his idea of win was kind of what happened was they gave up. His win was not, let's have a war and hopefully we have more nukes and we can bomb more things than them. So my view on that was that there's this fundamental misunderstanding of who he was, that he saw peace through strength as a mechanism. It was not the goal. It was the means. Yeah. And the means was genuine peace. This was not a man who imagined a world in which we have primacy where we crush anyone who gets in our way. That's not a peaceful world. And I think he understood enough about human nature that people don't accept that. That if you like, would Americans put up with that? That the Chinese would kind of crush us and have primacy. We'd be saying, build stuff, fight, be ready. I think he understood that about human nature.
Well, and in fact, here he is in his own words. This is at the 1988 UN General Assembly, where he talks very much about prioritizing peace.
I said at the first meeting in Geneva that this was a unique encounter between two people who had the power to start World War III or to begin a new age of peace among nations. And I also said peace conferences, arms negotiations, proposals for treaties could make sense only if they were part of a wider context, a context that sought to explore and resolve the deeper underlying differences between us. I said to Mr. Gorbachev then, as I have said to you before, nations do not mistrust each other because they're armed. They're armed because they mistrust each other.
See, just kind of to your point, what you literally just said a second ago, he's not saying, let's look around at all the way we can keep everybody under our boot around the world and use force to threaten them if they do anything we didn't. He's actually looking for peace mechanisms and negotiated settlements to try to create a peaceful environment so nobody wants to use force.
Well, if you look at the time his administration spent on arms negotiations, after 1983, it was more than on most any other issue. I mean, again, this is somebody who came into office emphasizing a military buildup, talked about the Soviet threat. But once he'd achieved some of those ends, he wanted to use it to make a safer world and a more peaceful world. And then Gorbachev comes along and he has that opportunity and he expands the goal. The goal, again, get rid of nuclear weapons. I mean, what other American president has ever advocated that? What politician, traditional politician, even Democratic or Republican, was pushing that, before? And I think that, as he indicated that he wanted peoples to work together. I mean, he was asked, when after Gorbachev came to power and he was dealing with Gorbachev, did he still consider the Soviet Union to be an evil empire? And he said no. The point is Reagan changed his opinion based on circumstances. He didn't say there that forever they're an evil empire. There was a particular leadership that had a certain set of objectives. Yeah, that was evil. And now suddenly they're gone. And when they're gone, he says, okay, deal with the new folks. And he was attacked by people like Norman Podhoretz for being an appeaser. They were horrified he's talking to Gorbachev. But let's face it, he got it right. I mean, again, we should look back and be thankful we had two men at the same time, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, who were committed to ending decades of Cold War. And to them is enormous credit due.
Now, I want to go back to something you brought up a couple of times now, and that's nuclear weapons and his fear of what that would mean for mankind, because it also animated his actions here. And the next thing, one of the other things you wrote in that article, Gary, if you can bring that out, you said that like Dwight Eisenhower in 1953 and 1956 and Lyndon Johnson in 1968, Reagan did not risk a general war to help liberate Eastern Europeans when they opposed Soviet troops. Indeed, from Reagan came no military moves, no aggressive threats, no economic sanctions. Reagan did little other than wait for the evil empire to further deteriorate from within. And the context of your comments there was about what was happening in Poland at the time and the potential threat of Soviet troops to try and crush their trying to come out into freedom. And you said he didn't take that. Now, that was written in 2015, so before this current Russia war here. So my question, in light of what you wrote there and what Reagan's thoughts were, what would he have done had he been president instead of Joe Biden in February 2022?
Well, let me take it even a little further back, Danny. Let's take it back to the Clinton administration with NATO expansion. Now, I mean, I want to be very careful claiming to speak for Ronald Reagan, of course. I mean, we don't know ultimately what he would have done. But I think that Reagan would have been much more hesitant to expand NATO, because that clip you played from the United Nations, he talked about removing mistrust. And the issue that came out of NATO expansion very clearly from Russian and Soviet officials was, this is mistrust. And you go to the Vladimir Putin's famous speech, 2007, the Munich Security Conference. And he commented, what happened to your promises not to expand NATO? This for us, does not create a trustful situation. I mean, he was very clear on that. So I think Reagan would have been much more insistent on trying to create a security architecture that included Russia. That he would have been quite aware, for example, you go back to the war against Serbia over Kosovo, 1999. I mean, this had a huge impact on Russian public opinion, not just the elite, but people, because historically Serbia was tied to Russia and was viewed as kind of a fellow Slav and other interests. And the view was, here comes the West. It says it's for peace, but it turns NATO into basically an aggressive alliance, dismantles the country, doesn't want Russia involved. I think all of those things, Reagan would have been thinking more in terms of, how do we include Russia? We have won. And he would say that we've won, but he would also say we've won because Russia or the Soviet Union, in a sense, agreed with us, made the policy changes. He wouldn't say we've won because we crushed them. I think the Clinton administration, especially, the view was, we defeated them. Well, they can't do anything about it. Screw them, right?
Yeah.
We can expand NATO. Tough. They can't do anything about it. To me, that. So I think if you bring, it's a starting point, we would have been in a radically different place, I think, with Reagan.
Yeah.
And in 2021, 2022, I think he would have negotiated. That he certainly would have. And I won't say that he would have agreed with Putin's terms. Again, I don't. Who knows? But I think that he would have engaged Putin seriously, not kind of blown it off. We can't talk about that. Well, it's only the most important issue, right? It's the one the Russians have talked about for 20 years. And you say you can't talk about it? I think Reagan would, of course we have to talk about it. I mean, I think that's when Reagan would understand that if you want peace, you're going to have to address those concerns.
And really towards that end, one of the things I want to play, the next clip here by Reagan, is from his inaugural address. And he seems to come down really forceful about, how he's willing to bring, the strength part of it. And I want you to notice in this clip, it's an interesting dynamic. He makes a really forceful statement at the beginning, a lot of applause. He has to stop his speech, and then he goes back into it. And I want your interpretation at the end, because the way it seems to me is that he's reinforcing, yes, I'm willing to be strong to defend our country, but I'm also wanting to have a peaceful environment so that I don't have to use this force. Watch this.
As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever. Our forbearance should never be misunderstood. Our reluctance for conflict should not be misjudged as a failure of will. When action is required to preserve our national security, we will act. We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength.
Now, I think that Reagan actually meant that. I think that he didn't want to use the strength. He wanted to have it as a deterrence and would use it if attacked. But I don't think he had any indication, and his track record certainly seems to indicate that he did not want to go around finding ways to use this weapon.
Well, if you look at his record, compare it, to his successors, the kind of wars that were fought, the times he used military force, he used it 3 times. Grenada, and that is, close to the United States. They were worried about American medical students. They were worried about Soviet relations with a more radical communist regime coming in. Libya, where it was retaliation for what was believed to be Libyan involvement in the bombing of a nightclub in Berlin that killed Americans and Germans. And, we did not go in and remake Libya. We didn't put troops in. We didn't occupy the place. This was in retaliation to say, don't do that. And the third was Lebanon. And that turned out very badly. And as I mentioned earlier, Reagan got it. Reagan learned from that. So you figure he's president for 8 years in the middle of the Cold War when all of these issues are happening. And that's the sum total of his use of the U.S. military. We had major buildup, troops all over. This is supposedly the wild cowboy that people were saying was going to get us into all these wars. And he didn't want to. This is someone, again, you have a president who says, I don't want to commit mass murder against Soviets. The only option you're giving me in terms of retaliation is to commit millions of deaths. I don't want to do that. Was. So I think that what he said was very true. Look, we will defend ourselves. And anyone who looks at the United States knows if this democracy really goes to war, it's serious. Japan woke the sleeping giant back in 1941, and oh my goodness, that was not a good idea. And they paid.
And let's don't get into that again. Now, you mentioned the Beirut situation a few times. I want to go to that and spend a little bit of time on it because I think it is so instructive to what we should be doing now and how I think some of our policies could change for the much better for us. You wrote that after the Beirut bombing, Reagan recognized that he'd erred. After briefly emphasizing retaliation, he decided not to double down and redeployed existing troops to naval vessels, which sailed home without fanfare. He consciously rejected a policy of Iraq light, invasion, occupation, and transformation. We should all be thankful that he had the courage to back down. You see, I've highlighted that, and I want you to talk about that in a second. Otherwise, thousands of Americans could have died fighting in another meaningless Middle East war. More enemies would have been created and terrorists would have been activated. So obviously, I don't want to speak for yourself, but it seems to me that's a pretty stark comparison to what we did do in 2003 Iraq and the consequences that rolled off of that. If Reagan had stuck with that and retaliation, which I know at the time many people were advocating that he should, to show that we're strong and to go in and let the terrorists win. And if he had doubled down on that and sent more troops in, there's no telling how many Americans would have been killed.
Look, this was an environment in which I read at one point there were like 25 different armed factions. You want to see a crazy conflict, you look at the Lebanese Civil War. mean, you have all these groups that are nominally Muslim or Christian, but of course this is more social than it is religious. And they'd all kind of, they'd kind of change dance partners routinely. I mean, the alliances would change, and suddenly these guys are with those guys. It's not like all the Christians are together. The phalangists are against the Maronites or something. So to put American troops in the middle of that, and you can go back and read newspapers at the time, the USS New Jersey sat offshore and bombarded Muslim villages. Well, what do you think that does? I mean, what do you think people, the idea was that they're supposed to be impressed with our strength. No, they looked for a way to retaliate. Now, they didn't thankfully have a Navy, but they were able to attack both the embassy and the Marine Corps barracks. So the idea of, you look, people like Dick Cheney criticized Reagan. And they argued, oh, this is one reason we had 9/11, because we didn't retaliate and do all this great stuff. Well, no. I mean, the longer you're in there, the more people you kill, the more hornets' nests you hit, the more other people want to attack you. And Reagan got that. And again, he learned. I mean, to me, this is one of those important moments. He understood that backing down is not popular. And he understood after Americans have died, it's hard to say, well, I guess there's not much more we can do. Let's leave. But that's what he did. Now, he was political the way he did it. You redeploy them to the ships, and at some point the ships sail away, and we probably don't put a press release out on that and mention that. But he was willing to back down. And
and I want to play that because you talk about how the transition in the immediate aftermath, he addressed the nation via a radio broadcast, which we have a clip of here. Play this.
They mistakenly believe that if they're cruel enough and violent enough, they will weaken American resolve and deter us from our effort to help build a lasting and secure peace in the Middle East. Well, if they think that, they don't know too much about America. As a free people, we've never allowed intimidation to stop us from doing what we know to be right. The best way for us to show our love and respect for our fellow countrymen who died in Beirut this week is to carry on with their task, to press harder than ever with our peacemaking efforts. And that's exactly what we're doing. More than ever, we're committed to giving the people of Lebanon the chance they deserve to lead normal lives, free from violence and free from the presence of all unwanted foreign forces on their soil.
Now, as you say, a year later, the really kind of an obscure comment or article in the New York Times, which I have a shot of here. It was just kind of the side of it. It wasn't even a major article, really. Just U.S. withdrawing its military forces on Lebanon coast. And the article continued on there to talk about, that they had moved offshore, like you said. Reagan didn't make any comments here. He didn't make any speeches. He just kind of let it quietly die, as you say. Then everybody kind of moved on somewhere else. But I specifically want to ask you about the thought that, so he was saying in the clip immediately afterwards that, well, we care about the Lebanese civil people, about them having peace and democracy and all this kind of stuff. But what transitioned between that time and his decision about a year or so later to basically quietly go on? Because one could say, well, so now all of a sudden he doesn't care about their peace and freedom anymore. Was it something that he just said the cost is going to be too high? Or did he, as you say, there were so many groups, did he calculate that we're not going to succeed in that anyway, so let's don't try to double down on failure?
I think the realization came, the more you study the situation in Lebanon, it's a tragedy. I mean, you still see war damaged buildings in Beirut and elsewhere. I mean, this is a country that hundreds of thousands of dead. I think it was a roughly 15-year civil war. I mean, utterly horrendous. And you bring military people in and say, I want to bring peace to Lebanon. And who has a good idea? Well, good luck, right? I mean, Americans are going to do this. At some point, I suspect somebody said, well, if you really want to do that, we need a lot more troops. I mean, we have this one little garrison here and we have some ships offshore. That's not going to bring peace. So then you start thinking about what would it take. And at some point, I think you realize you have just feckless allies. Well, we worked with the Maronite president of Lebanon, who basically ruled Beirut or something. Well, that's not enough. Well, then what? So I think this is where reality came in. The Reagan had very high-minded goals. If he could, he'd love to bring peace to other people. I mean, I think that was right. That we want to help these people. What was going on was terrible. It was awful. but there's a point where he recognized America can't do that. And of course, his primary responsibility was to the American people. And he very much felt that loyalty to the people in uniform, that you don't send them over on a mission that you can't even really specify, and let alone have a plan to achieve. I mean, okay, we're going to do what in the middle of the Lebanese civil war? Okay, well, we were there kind of supporting the government, bombarding Druze and Muslims, depending upon their loyalty, and the response is we get blown up. And well, okay, now what are we going to do? I mean, you don't have enough troops to actually do much. And are you prepared to put a lot more? And I think all of that, the reality really came home to him. And again, to his credit, he left. I mean, none of this, you look at Afghanistan, we had presidents who clearly recognized that this isn't going well, but nobody wants to be charged with the failure. And I will give Joe Biden credit on this. He was willing to pull out. And I mean, Trump said he wanted to leave, and we were still there 4 years later. I mean, look before him, Obama. I mean, he increased troop levels, but then, okay, now where are we? You just figure you kick the can down the road. Reagan didn't want to do that. Then I think, to his great credit, and again, let's say he was very political. I think he was clever. I mean, I love that headline about this: frees up Marines for other duty, right? We didn't do this because it's a failed mission. We did it, because there's other stuff we kind of got to do. I mean, this is wonderful. Actually, that's fine. If that's what it takes to get our people out of harm's way, I'll take it.
Right. And that's one of the things that has frankly angered me to no end, especially during the Obama time. Trump it seemed to try to get some of these troops out of there, especially Syria, and he failed several times, although that's frankly still deserves some blame because he is the commander in chief and he shouldn't have allowed himself to be pressured by these other people. But now here Biden has continued on with these troops in Iraq and Syria with no value to our country whatsoever. And he doesn't value the troops on the ground there, because I've been screaming since 2019 that those guys need to be withdrawn before any get killed. And of course, now 3 have been, and we're still getting attacked to this day. And who knows if another one's going to be successful. They're not prioritizing
serious injuries. Even the ones that haven't been killed, we've had serious, head injuries and stuff. I mean, to me, this is outrageous. If you're going to put your people over there, you protect them. You put your people over there and just let this happen. I mean, for what? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it's maybe a little naive, I guess, although it's certainly wishful thinking that we need some kind of a leader who is political and understands that there's things, and ways that things have to work in the world, but that actually values human life, prioritizes the protection of America, and recognizes when something's not going to work and quit doubling down. I see that on everything that we're doing right now. And now that we're here, we're at a new inflection point in the Russia-Ukraine war. Instead of recognizing the 2023 offensive, it didn't work. You gave them every chance. It was a complete disaster. Now that instead of giving another $61 billion, we should say, this is not going to work. It's time to shut this down. Instead, we keep the fiction going on. No, we're going to keep going. And now Zelensky's asking for another 10 years of support.
And again, there's no plan. I mean, it's not as if, okay, Mr. President, what is your plan? We're going to spend this money and then what happens? Well, I don't know, right? I mean, we all know that they're going to ask for more money at the end of the year and next year. And, so, okay. And, now, I mean, I read about how some of them say, well, we want to make sure that Ukraine can negotiate. Well, we could have negotiated in late 2021 or early 22. Right. We could have supported the Russian-Ukrainian negotiation in like April of 2022. No, we give up all those opportunities when Ukraine. I mean, the damage suffered was much, much less, and you could have had an outcome that ended the war before the worst of the destruction and killing. But no. So now, after 2 years of this, we should negotiate. Really? I mean. And how does this help? What are we doing to promote negotiation? Are we talking to the Russians? I mean, who knows? No, as far as I can tell, no, nothing. This is just spend money.
And of course, Zelensky, the idea that we want to help them get better so that they can negotiate from a position of more strength than they have right now is nonsense, because the minute that they start having success, nobody's going to say negotiate. They're going to say, keep going, go further. But that's just not going to happen.
Exactly. And, the problem here, I mean, when we think about escalation, that's the good news, in terms of escalation, is that the Russians believe they're winning. Because as you indicated on Crimea, if the Russians believe they're losing, and especially losing on issues they think are existential, losing territory that they viewed as part of Russia, they will escalate. And then what happens? And we're just kind of, we're convinced Putin's, he's a wimp, I mean, he won't do anything. And no, I mean, the dangers of this are extraordinary, and we have no plan. We have no strategy. Just throw more money, kind of hope. I mean, I read this stuff. Well, maybe in 2025, the Ukrainians can go on the offensive. Well, number one, I have no idea if that's true. And number two, the last offensive didn't work out very well. So why do we think this one will be better? This is all just kind of fantasy. We're not building this based on realistic hopes. It's just kind of a fantasy. Throw money, and hopefully something good will happen. And of course, Ukrainians are dying in the meantime. Infrastructure is being destroyed. The country's being ravaged. And I just think that the opportunity to make peace and for the Ukrainians to preserve as much of their country as they can diminishes. That eventually there will be a negotiation. And unless things change, the longer we go, the worse it's going to get for Ukraine.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And there's no prospect for anything to flip around, because the fundamentals of combat are what they are. And our wishing them away doesn't change any of that. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have anybody like a Reagan who's either aware of all these fundamentals or that he cares. Because one of the things I think that really has stood out to me about through this whole session we've had here is that you say the president actually cared about the people and didn't want even the Russians to be dying unnecessarily. And that doesn't seem to be the case among our senior elite anymore.
No, I think in many ways it's kind of shocking, is that, we're number one, people are saying, oh, well, look, it's great. We're making jobs, right? All this money is going to the death merchants in America. I'm supposed to be happy about that. And the second they say is at a very low cost, we're ruining the Russian military. Well, I typically don't think of Russia as being an eternal enemy where we want to have this indirect war. But number two, how are we ruining the Russian military? Well, it's because Ukrainians are dying. So I, as American, am supposed to be happy that Ukrainians are giving up their lives to achieve our end, I suppose, of somehow damaging the Russians. And I'm supposed to be happy that my money's being spent, on the kind of military industrial complex that more jobs are created, the more people we kill. I mean, this is what America has come down to. This is an American principle.
Yeah, that's been one of the things that we've lamented on our show many times, and would love to see different. But we have what we have, and we have to hope that the good things about Ronald Reagan, the spirit of Reagan, the things that he did, valuing American national security, valuing the people, and doing whatever it took to seek peace. That was the priority, not putting our boot on somebody's neck. And we seem to have lost that. And I hope we get that back one of these days. But Doug, thanks so much for coming on today and sharing with these things. We're really grateful for this insight, and wish you continued well.
I agree. Been great being on, Danny. Glad to be with you again. Look forward to doing it again in the future.
Look forward to it as well. And again, we thank you guys for coming on. As we always do, please like and subscribe, and we will have another couple of shows on tomorrow. We have Jason, like we've had on several times. He's going to be on tomorrow. And we've got a new guest here. So tune into that. We have a new special for you tomorrow. Thanks. And we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.